Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here today to review Halloween Kills. I'm gonna have to put this review in a certain kind of way because I already feel like this is gonna be like a difficult approach to talking about this one. Halloween Kills feels way too much like Halloween 2. Basically, it almost feels like a quasi copying and pasting, but like really we are to have some really interesting brutal kills within this movie. There are some really interesting times where of course Michael Myers is to kill people, but that's all we can really rest this movie on: Michael Myers killing people. And here's the interesting thing. Jamie Lee Curtis was to be said to be in this movie, but I can't help but think that her actual role in this film, feels to me like when Wolverine was supposed to be popping his claws in some other X-Men film that was to be in the prequel movies. Where eventually he was supposedly come back, just get mind melded with the younger Jean Grey, for him to eventually go off and be his own Weapon X self in one of the prequel films. To me, honestly, Jamie Lee Curtis feels like a clickbaited character to me to make me want to be interested in coming back into here. But we also do have some tying back into the other characters of the Halloween franchise. But mostly it just ties into the early characters of the early Halloween films, I mean. So But really, this really covers mostly, instead of it actually being Laurie having to take down Michael in this movie, it really is just to be that the town is to try and take down Michael in this film, and really there is to be chaos that ensued because of Michael returning again. Like, it basically is to take place on pretty much the exact same night of the last film. So it's basically a quick transition of what had happened from the other Halloween film. So it's an obviously copy and pasting of the other Halloween 2 movie where Laurie is to be in the hospital. And so yeah, it's basically a ripping and tearing from the, so there isn't as much effort put into this film, in all honesty. Halloween, that movie, the 2018 whichever movie, that was actually good. I actually enjoyed that. This movie just was like, if that last Halloween movie was great, I would say that this movie kind of is to go a little bit backwards. Like, it falls into the okay, this movie was overall okay. The only good thing about it is Michael killing people, and that's it. That's all we can really rest on. And kind of going back to the same kind of wells as we really have to really tell you, like, okay, Michael's big thing isn't really just going after certain kind of people. It's just going back to a certain kind of thing. Let's just say. So with that said, let's go. Yeah, like really, it's an okay movie. The best part about it is just what I've said before: Michael just brutally killing a bunch of people. But that's all this movie really has to rest on, besides certain people from the franchise of this beginning coming back. Like, we don't have Paul Rudd from The Curse of Michael Myers. He comes back weirdly. No. And plus, they kind of have to recreate certain things from the following from the very first Halloween movie to what this is. So a lot of people will be happy about those scenes, just get like some flashback stuff that maybe we didn't get to see between Halloween 1 and Halloween 2. But again, that's really all we actually get. So with that said, let's just go into spoilers. Let's go ahead and bust this out because without a doubt, it's that customary time yet again to go into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time to spoil this movie. So, very beginning of this movie is to relate to the very first Halloween film, where what eventually ends up happening is we are to have these detectives tell us that Loomis had the therapist Loomis had shot Michael Myers multiple times, and so certain sheriffs are to be sent out to eventually head to Michael Myers' home, and it seems that a lot of them, or a lot of these characters are mentioned, like, yeah, Hadley, like a town where nothing really happens except for on Halloween, right? So, uh, so eventually, what happens in this scene is we have these two detectives that are going into Michael Myers' house to just reflect on, yeah, this is where it happened. Uh, and so evidently this was to happen seemingly like the whole like original time where Michael Myers was to go and actually stab his sister evidently had gone on into the 60s, and so this Halloween movie took place in the 70s, so it took some time before Michael could eventually get out of course, his mental hospital to eventually go after Laurie in this first film because, of course. So, these detectives go into Michael Myers' home, find a dog who had been dead, just like, because I recently just seen the Halloween movie, and I'm like, oh yes, they're just replaying the same scene over again. And so they end up finding a dead dog, which they end up finding in Halloween. So eventually they go and they try to look around into Michael Myers' home to have eventually Michael Myers pop out and grab one of these detectives and hold this detective. And so the detective ends up trying to shoot Michael Myers and ends up actually shooting this detective in the throat. And so Michael Myers is to basically just walk off, and this detective is trying to like revive or keep this one detective alive. And so what eventually ends up happening is there seems to be a swarm of a bunch of detectives that are all in front of this house, and eventually Loomis is to like call out to this detective to like tell him what all or ask him what all had happened. And so basically there's just a bunch of guns pointed at Michael Myers, and so supposedly Loomis was going to want to shoot Michael Myers in the head, and so someone was to stop him before that was to happen. And so eventually that's how I guess naturally Michael Myers just went off into the second movie, and eventually is to now be in more current time. So we also had a scene where we had Cameron, evidently a boy who is to be in love with Laurie's granddaughter, who is Allison. Cameron is to eventually find the sheriff of this town, who is to be Sheriff uh, or Officer Hawkins, who is to be bleeding out of his neck. So Cameron is to call, I guess, 911 to help this guy out. So he eventually ends up getting sent to the hospital. And so, because I want to cover all the current time stuff all in one blip of here. So Laurie's getting sent off to the hospital. She's being sent into an ambulance to go off to, or it's either an ambulance or they're just kind of driving to the hospital as quickly as possible because Laurie is eventually going to possibly bleed out. So, what ends up happening is that there is to be a fire department trying to douse out the flames of this home, and Laurie is trying to scream to the emergency people, like, don't do that, like, let the house burn. So, we end up having firefighters who are to eventually go on and try to douse the flames of this, to eventually have certain firefighters trying to go into the home, finding out if anyone is there, and they find Michael, who is eventually going to murder and kill a bunch of firefighters. And then eventually, when a lot of firefighters are surrounding the house, Michael kills all of them too. Eventually, one of the firefighters is to have this like big, huge saw of a thing, and Michael just takes this saw from this guy, overpowers him, and then basically just slices through him with this saw. So, so the next thing we end up seeing is we are at this bar, who I guess they're either doing karaoke or something. So it seems like we have this nurse and doctor who are in costume that are just kind of hearing about the whole Michael Myers story. And so we have the nurse who is costumed as a doctor who is asking like, "Hey, that Michael Myers story, huh?" And so all of a sudden we have the bartender who kind of like letting this guy know about this horror story. So, uh, we also end up having this one kid who's Lonnie, who evidently is to get bullied by some kids, and eventually he, in a flashback, ends up bumping into Michael Myers and live to tell the tale. And so all of a sudden we in this movie are to eventually see Tommy Doyle appear at this bar and is to mention this story about Michael Myers and the boogeyman and all that stuff, and that there actually is several survivors of that whole event who are at this bar as well. They have Lonnie, who is to, of course, be there, who faced face to face with Michaels and lived to tell the tale, and then Lindsay, who of course was actually Lindsay from the original Halloween movie, she's here. And so I guess the guy that actually played originally Tommy, like, I guess he probably wasn't interested in being in the role or whatever. Um, or any number of reasons anything happened with that. So they ended up getting Anthony Michael Hall. Okay, sure. Like, all right. So, but then they also end up getting the original nurse from the original Halloween movie too, where the original nurse who was to have uh, Michael grab her car from the Loomis guy. Uh, like, she was also there at that bar because she had survived almost being killed by Michael. So they're all basically having a drink about this whole story, and so all of a sudden, like the nurse and the doctor are to hear this, and so they're to like, "Hey man, how about we buy you a drink?" And I'm like, "I'm sorry, like the worst possible time to really just go out and booze is probably on Halloween, especially in this town, because eventually you'll just stumble along home and eventually get killed. But whatever, I guess it's whatever, right?" So all of a sudden, the nurse and the doctor are to head home, and so all of a sudden, supposedly the doctor of this costume duo is to eventually mention that supposedly Michael is quite possibly in this car, and so we end up having Tommy, who decides to go and check this out by holding a bat. And so eventually it seems that this car is to eventually drive away and eventually crash somewhere, but there is no Michael. So eventually we just have Tommy, who's deciding to round everybody up, and he is to decide, you know what, like, evil dies tonight. We've had this problem for far too many years, and this is getting ridiculous. Like, come on. Like, if the sheriffs and the police can't take him down, then it's our turn. It's our turn to take back our town, because this has happened far too often. So what ends up happening is Laurie is to make it to the hospital, and so eventually she, of course, is getting sewed up and getting pumped up with the painkillers and all kinds of medication, and so we have Laurie's daughter, who is to be Karen, and Allison, who are filing reports with certain kind of detectives. And so Karen is to assume that they had finally gotten Michael, but the detectives are telling her, oh no, like, yeah, he's still out there, he's still killing. And Karen is like, well, I don't know if we can really confirm that or not, and I don't think that I'm going to tell my mother that, because, like, she'll just eventually want to go out and try to kill him, and plus we can't really confirm whether or not it's actually Michael or somebody dresses him or whatever. So eventually there is to also be a point where there is some crazed man who they naturally assume is Michael Myers, and so evidently he is to be at this hospital, and so, like, the whole town is going to eventually try to go after this guy and try to kill him, and so he's going to eventually take his own life, and eventually they can't even confirm whether or not that is to have actually been Michael or not, so, because they never really saw his actual face when he took his mask off, so they're like, well, maybe that's not Michael Myers after all. So eventually what ends up happening is that Sheriff Hawkins eventually shows up at this hospital, and so Laurie is now reminiscing with Hawkins, and eventually Laurie is to mention to Hawkins that she killed him, like, she finally got him, and Hawkins is like, well, it's about frickin' time. Like, and so eventually they're reminiscing that at possibly one point that those two had gotten together, because Hawkins is to mention that he really did love Laurie, but things just didn't quite exactly work out. So what ends up happening is that we end up having a bunch of people decide to go out and defend the city on their own, instead of having the police completely getting involved. So Tommy is basically orchestrating this. So we end up having this one car filled with this nurse and Lindsay and this costumed doctor and nurse going out and eventually going and finding these kids and trying to prevent them from getting hurt on this night. But the kids are to tell Lindsay that there was to be some guy in this white mask that was going around, like, poking through like hedges and stuff like that, and bushes and whatever. And so all of a sudden Lindsay is to spot that that was Michael, and because Michael has arrived here. And so all of a sudden we start to have some of these characters try to shoot their guns at Michael, but it really doesn't do much good. And so eventually Michael is to tear through all of these people and eventually just start knifing them in this car and killing most of them off, leaving Lindsay to eventually run off into this one part of this park where eventually Michael does not get to her. So let's not forget the one spot where eventually Michael was to go through this one home with this elderly couple who are thinking they are going to get down to business, if you know what I mean. They're going to go at it. Both Phil and Sandra. Sandra is going and playing with this one drone, and then all of a sudden Phil is to realize that there is someone in their house. So all of a sudden Michael is to take Phil and basically take him into this glass door and murder him, and then take this large light bulb thing, crush it, and stab Sandra with the neck of this. And so that's not all. Michael goes and puts several knives into Phil and then walks off. So, like, kind of dragging him through the house to make sure, I guess, that he's definitely dead numerous times over. So, while kind of just Sandra is technically, I guess, forced to watch while she's slowly but surely dying. So, uh, like, there's so many random parts to this movie. Like, there's also these two guys in Michael Myers' home that are to eventually have these trick-or-treaters that end up stealing all their candy, and they're like, ha ha ha, we worked you guys, ha ha ha, like, you guys are stupid, because supposedly the trick-or-treaters were to mention to Big John and Little John that someone was to eat one of their candy bars and get a razor blade in it. And so they're like, oh my God. So they're like, call the hospital, call anybody. And so all of a sudden the kids are like, haha, we got you and we took all your candy. And so all of a sudden Big John comes out and he is to mention that, hey, like, you shouldn't mess with anybody, especially in this house, because this is Michael Myers' house and, like, he's going to get people and blah, 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 blah. So these kids end up running off, and so eventually what ends up, like, actually happening is that eventually Michael is to head back into this home eventually later on in the night, and eventually goes and basically finds Big John and knifes him first and kills him. And then all of a sudden Little John goes into the room where Michael is, and Little John is like, oh my God, Michael, you're home. And so it winds up that Michael ends up stabbing Little John also. And so what basically ends up happening is we end up having Tommy uh, and a group like Allison and Tommy, and, well, not even Tommy. Like, Tommy, I think, is just on his own little thing. We have Allison, we have Cameron, and we have Cameron's father, who are to eventually go and figure out that Michael is just heading right back to his old home. That, yeah, he went for Laurie's compound first, but he's really just straight lining it right to where his actual home is. And he's going to kill people along the way. So eventually they easily figure that out. And so, and they also end up finding Lindsay also. And they find a lot of other people dead. All the people are dead, and they're all wearing these Halloween costumes, like the nurse and the doctor wearing a pumpkin mask and a skeleton mask, and the nurse who was in the first Halloween movie, she was to be, like, strung up wearing a witch costume, and so they end up finding Lindsay, and they end up bringing her, and I think they put her into the hospital. So eventually Tommy is riling up everyone in this hospital to, like, hey, like, evil ends tonight, we're going to take back our town, this isn't going to happen anymore. And so Tommy eventually goes after the crazy person with all this group of rampaging people. And so Laurie just decides that she's going to take the medication from this nurse and stab it into her and just be like, okay, well, like, it's going to numb up the pain. So I'm going to have to go out and try to eventually go after Michael because it's on like Donkey Kong. But then eventually Laurie just sticks into, because eventually she ends up going out in the chaos of all these people running around in this hospital trying to get to this crazy person who eventually ends up just jumping off this roof anyways. What a waste of time that was. And eventually Laurie ends up getting hurt, I guess, ends up reopening her stitches up to where she's forced to be back to sleeping or like laying into this bed. And really, the only thing left for her to really do, Laurie, in this movie is to just go on and on about this speech about how Michael is stronger than any mortal man, and that basically you can't take down Michael with brute force, and that eventually, like, there is no like taking this guy down because he uh, lives off of fear and evil and whatever, and they're just like really just saying how Michael is just such a boogeyman, and I'm like, we already know this. We already know how tough and how whatever Michael is, but keep on saying it to just waste a stretch of time. And I'm just like, seriously? Like we have to really build up the lore of Michael Myers if we haven't had a million films do that already? Whatever. So what ends up happening is Allison, Cameron, and Cameron's dad make it to Michael Myers' house, which Michael Myers is at. So we have Cameron's father who ends up going in there first, where of course, wouldn't you think it, he ends up dead. So Cameron goes in there, and of course, he makes it up the stairs, and then eventually he gets like knifed up and then brutally killed, like killed during this stairwell where like he ends up getting like rammed through this stairwell, and then he ends up just getting killed by all these like stairwell pieces. And so Allison tries to make her way up to try to help Cameron, and she ends up getting like one shotgun shot off, and then she ends up getting tossed down these stairs just to watch Cameron brutally be killed. Sadly enough, tear for Cameron, because who really cares? Like, there's so many people where I'm like, I don't really care if these people die or not. I really just don't. Sadly enough, it just doesn't matter to me. So, so all of a sudden, we end up having Michael Myers who is making his way down the stairs. And so we end up having Laurie talking to Karen, and it's like, we have to do something. Like, we have to try and take down Michael Myers. Like, and, like, we had it to where, like, Laurie, like, had planned this out for hefty, like, in that other Michael Myers movie, like, man, did she really plan and map and figure this whole thing out. But in this movie, it just feels like they're winging it, obviously. To where even where it seems like there is a plan, there really isn't a plan. It's just, so... so what ends up happening is that Michael is almost going to kill Allison. And so Allison is like, do it! Like, freaking kill me! Do it! And so all of a sudden she's also saying do it because Karen is to come with a pitchfork, stabbing Michael and taking him down, grabbing his mask, and then forcing now Michael to come after her, to follow her. So Michael ends up coming down the street to eventually realize that there is all of a sudden a lynch mob after him because Karen is like, ha, gotcha, because she tosses his mask to give it to him. And so all of a sudden there's to be this lynch mob circling around him. And like this is trying to basically kill off eventually some people, so we'll get to that. So so Michael Myers is now seemingly beat up, or getting beat up by getting clubbed by hockey sticks and baseball bats and getting shot a couple times and whatever. But then eventually, and like Tommy swinging his baseball bat against Michael. And so eventually Karen is to think like, oh man, like they've got this. Like, I think he's gonna finally die now. And Tommy is telling Karen to go find her daughter, so that way like he can take Karen can take care of her daughter. So so Karen runs off to go and do that, and so eventually she thinks that all is at well in hand, that these guys are just going to take him down. Oh no! Michael just gets right back up and then just starts slicing and dicing through all of these people and eventually just kills Tommy also. So, like, everybody who is to be there eventually just dies. And we end up having also Karen ends up getting killed as well. When eventually she's to be kind of looking through this window to eventually have Michael just stabbing her and brutally killing her. And I'm like, oh no, like Karen's now dead. So now we can just expect there to be another Halloween movie where Laurie is still now wanting to get her brutal revenge after Michael had killed her daughter, is what I'm naturally assuming. Like, I don't know, or I didn't see if Allison is dead. She probably is, or if not, then, like, it really should be left with just having Laurie really just left, anyways. They should have killed every single person off at this point and let no one left from the other movie or this one alive. To eventually not have, like, if Laurie's gonna have somebody, like, it should be like either Hawkins and that's it. Because I don't want anybody left from this thing. Plus, it would be great if there was an actual, real, legitimately good plan, which basically indefinitely makes it so Michaels does not come back. And then they can finally just rest easy on the fact, like, cement the effer. Like, get him in cement, put him in like a statue that is to be lasting forever, where he cannot get out of it. I don't think they've acided Michael yet, so like dip him in acid, figure that out. Like, come on, like, figure out a new way to kill this guy, because they haven't done that in this film either. They just think like, oh yeah, we can just continue to burn him and put him in a fire and he'll die. No, they did that in two. In two, he just came right back. So again, putting him in a fire, obviously now twice, has not worked. So they needed to dip him in cement or dip him in acid, get rid of him finally, figure that out, come up with some kind of trick way for Michael to finally rest and to finally die, so that way they don't, like, and maybe they reboot the thing where it's no longer Michael is this weird demented creep of a guy, and it's now just somebody who's to be like a quite possible copycat killer. Or maybe after all this time, finally Michael forcibly knocked boots with somebody and created a child. And then that like carries on the whole, like Michael had weirdly a child during at some point in his years of killing. I don't know. But with that said, I think that's all I got. Or it would be interesting, yeah, like have it be that like Michael did have a moment of weakness or of whatever where he pops out a baby and all of a sudden Michael's son is now going to have to kill Michael, and like Michael and Michael's son are as equally as unstoppable as and it's so it's going to be a long stretch of a battling between, and so like I don't know. That's the only way you can really do this at this point, because like you basically just like kind of killed most of Laurie's people. Like, what is there really left to do? Like, hopefully in the next Halloween movie, Laurie is in the movie a lot more than this one. But with that said, I think I'm gonna get the heck out of here. I think in a roundabout way, I said most of what goes on in this movie, but really, this movie just isn't as good as the other one. Really kind of clickbaits you on the whole Laurie thing to think that, oh, she's going to take down Michael in this one, but she doesn't really feel at all involved. She's just there to drop some lines, and that's about it. Um, Man, it must have been a really hard, must have been a really hard job for her to just come back for this movie. Sadly enough, because she spends a lot of time in the hospital. But hey, like freaking like to do another one of these movies is so challenging. There's been too many of them, so it's really hard to try and come at this again. But I'm gonna get out of here. Bye, everybody. Bye, everybody.